Ahoy there, this is Derek, the Convicted Cinephile here. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Instagram at convicted_cinephile. I wanted to talk about something that's always been super important and special to me, and that is superhero movies. We are extremely spoiled in the amount of superhero films we get nowadays, to the point of it being ridiculous, and it's getting to the point of being tiresome for a lot of people who aren't diehard fans. But I'm old enough to remember and appreciate that it was never always that way. Like anyone, I love Superman, I love Batman, but back in the late 80s and even into the early 90s, it was hard being a more of a Marvel fan, like I always have been, especially starting in the early 90s when I started collecting action figures and trading cards. Especially, I could do a whole hour-long video series just about all the trading cards I still have. Maybe I will. If you want me to, let me know. Maybe I'll do a video about my complete sets of old 90s Marvel trading cards if you guys are curious. I've been geeking out about stuff like that forever. But it was always hard to be a movie lover and a Marvel fan 30 years ago. We did not have any good superhero movies outside of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, which I love. And even in that case, only the first two are really great. The other two are just kind of guilty pleasures that I grew up with. And the Michael Keaton Batman movies. But the comic book film was essentially dead by the time Batman and Robin put a bullet in its head. But as a Marvel fan, it was even harder. We were lucky enough to have a couple really good animated series with the X-Men and Spider-Man shows. But outside of that, there was no good live-action superhero movies with Marvel characters back then. I used to always catch a glimpse on cable of the old Dolph Lundgren Punisher film, which is by no means, a great movie. They were so questionable about superhero films back then that the skull icon in the Punisher film literally shows up in one shot, and it's like on the side of his knife. Like, they tried to separate it so much from the comic book origins because they just thought it was like a bad omen or something back then. And Marvel didn't know what the hell they were doing, especially because DC was lucky enough to be partnered slash, partially owned by Warner Brothers. So they had major studio backing when they wanted to make a Superman or a Batman movie. So those films came out, for better or worse, good, at least technologically speaking, but they at least had effort and money put into them, with the exception of Superman 4, which was a canon film, but it's so bad it's good. I love it. I can't put into words how excited I was when I went into the Mr. Movies as a 4 or 5-year-old boy and saw this poster hanging on the wall. This was the coolest damn thing I've ever seen in my life. I was so excited for a Captain America movie to come out, not being old enough to understand that it was a miserable failure and it was a direct-to-video film, one that I love to this day as a it's so bad it's good movie. It's released by Shout Factory, so do yourself a favor and pick this up if you're able to, because it's just hilarious. It's not as bad as it could be, but it's definitely not as good as it should be. The later MCU movies definitely showed how it was done. Yeah. There's that. I love that poster artwork. So I rented it when it came out, of course, and even back then I was like, this is stupid. A 5-year-old kid shouldn't be able to watch a Captain America movie and realize how bad it is. That's what I'm saying. I remember in 4th grade, I was in class, and some kid had a magazine. I don't know what magazine it was, but in it was an article about the Fantastic Four movie being made, and there was pictures of the behind-the-scenes thing, and I was like, oh my god, a Fantastic Four movie. That's amazing. And then it just didn't happen because they were literally making it. Roger Corman Productions made a Fantastic Four movie for $1 million with no intention of releasing it, and nobody involved with making the actual movie outside of Roger Corman knew that. So a lot of people's hard work got screwed, and till this day that film has never been officially released in any form. But luckily I have a DVD bootleg copy of it that has actually been remastered and looks pretty damn good for the most part, all things considered. So it's fun to watch this. I've borrowed it to many people who like superhero movies and didn't know this was a thing. And, it's a good time. It's obviously very illegitimate, but I love that I own this. And to this day, it's still, sadly, the best Fantastic Four movie that's ever been made. Sadly, no one's really seen it outside of diehard fans and people who like to laugh at crappy movies. It's true. If you haven't seen that movie, it's the best Fantastic Four movie ever made, bar none. Not the highest quality looking, but as far as adaptation-wise and kind of the spirit of the comic, I think it's the best. And that was it. For years. I started almost growing out of it, my like of superheroes. Other than like Batman Forever that came out, which I loved because I was a Batman kid who loves Jim Carrey and the Riddler, so it was like my favorite thing ever at the time. Outside of that, there was no good superhero movies. For some reason, Hollywood thought, do you know what kids will like? Let's take old comic strips from the 40s and turn them into movies like The Phantom or The Shadow and make those into movies. And nobody fucking cares about those characters. But for some reason in the 90s, Hollywood was obsessed with taking old serials and making old TV shows into new movies, like The Other Avengers, which is like one of the most worst movies ever made, according to anyone who's ever seen it. The Flintstones movie, that's a good example. And good is a very loose term. It was the comic book movie of the 90s, was the TV show into a movie, for sure. Just imagine being 13 years old, never having a good Marvel Comics character turned into a movie outside of a thing that never got released that I still to that day, at that point, hadn't seen yet. A Captain America movie that was so forgettable, like I couldn't remember anything about it other than the poster, and the Punisher movie that was on cable once in a while. Other than that, there was the old Hulk TV show that I loved as a kid. Hulk was always my favorite. I loved watching the Hulk TV movies with Thor and Daredevil. That's what I survived on. That's all we had. And the much worse Doctor Strange and Spider-Man and Captain America TV movies. Starring Reb Brown, who's amazing. But yeah, 13-year-old me goes into a movie theater. This is before the internet ruined everything. And seeing a poster for Blade. And nowadays he's a well enough known character because of the film. But most kids my age probably wouldn't have even known who the hell Blade was. But I did, just because of the comics I had. And a lot of those comics were just almost encyclopedic comics talking about characters and telling their origins and their abilities, and all my trading cards I grew up having. So I always had Blade cards every year. So I knew who this was. I was so fucking excited seeing this movie. I had just turned 13 a couple weeks before it came out in theaters. And I saw it opening weekend, and it was the coolest thing ever at that point. And a lot of things that happened in The Matrix, as far as like cool black trench coat movies, Blade started that first. I don't care. It was the first cool black trench coat kung fu movie before The Matrix pretended it was. It finally happened. There was finally a genuinely good, at least for the people who give a shit, Marvel movie that came out in theaters and people saw it, and it made over $100 million at the box office, at least worldwide, which at the time was still good. This is before the worldwide box office became as massive as it is today with its billions and billions of grossing dollars. $100 million plus movie was still impressive as hell, especially for a movie that probably only cost 30-ish million to make, I'd imagine, if that. And things were looking up. And then around this time, Marvel was bankrupt. Like, they literally went bankrupt in the late 90s. So just imagine that the Marvel Studios you know today could have possibly never existed because the company went bankrupt. And that's why they had to start selling their rights to all the different studios for their characters. As a child of the 90s and of Fox TV, I had always loved the X-Men as well. So when they announced the X-Men movie, which I have the old Blu-ray trilogy here, I was literally having heart palpitations in the theater. I was so excited to see X-Men the first time. And even though half of the characters I like aren't even in the damn movie, like Colossus or Nightcrawler until the sequels. It was still so awesome. I was a little disappointed because so many of my favorite characters weren't in the movie, but it was still, there's no words to describe how amazing it is to finally see something you've loved for so long on the big screen. I always say when Avengers Endgame came out, it's not something I had been waiting a whole year to see, or even 10 years. It was literally something I'd been waiting 30 years to see in theaters. A movie with all these characters together, with that storyline like that. And then right after X-Men happened, what was probably the peak of pre-MCU Marvel was Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. You could argue the second one's a better movie. I've always preferred the first one a little bit, probably because it was the first one. The second one is obviously just as good, if not better. Once again, heart palpitations due to excitement of seeing Spider-Man the first time in theaters. I was in my junior year of high school when that came out. I saw it 5 times, I think, in theaters. The first Spider-Man movie. I worked there at the time, so it was free. So, I could see it 5 times in a row without it being a big deal. Like, these things, they're important to me in that way, and I've watched them all so many times now. With the exception of Punisher, I kind of just didn't watch as a kid. I just knew it was a thing. I just bought it recently on DVD at Goodwill, so I was like, I need this. I need to watch this again. It needs to be part of my collection because I like having all the non-MCU superhero movies that I can. Just because, I like to respect where we came from in the superhero geek community. It's hard to believe that even after Spider-Man hit, there were still 6 years before the first MCU film with Iron Man. Because after that we had the 2000s bump of X-Men, and then we had had Spider-Man, and then we had X-Men 2, Daredevil, and Hulk all in the same year. Those obviously have mixed reviews. I liked Daredevil when I saw it in theaters. I didn't mind. I just liked seeing a Daredevil movie. I wasn't super picky about it. It was just fun to see a Daredevil movie for the first time. Yes, it's not great. The director's cut is slightly better. Hulk is my favorite character. He always was when I was a kid. I loved the Ang Lee Hulk film. It gets so much crap. It's easily the best Hulk adaptation in a movie yet. Is it a slow film? Yes. Is it 20 minutes too long at least? Yes. But it is the best adaptation of the character and his inner psyche about his past that haunts him, that makes him the Hulk that he is. The other films essentially ignore that completely. They're more fun, and I love Mark Ruffalo playing Bruce Banner, and he obviously looks better in the newer movies and does cooler stuff because technology. But that first Hulk film, watching a live-action guy Hulk out for the first time a few times throughout that movie and watching him beat the shit out of the army, it was like the coolest goddamn thing ever. It was taken seriously, and that's why I respect it more than a lot of the movies nowadays. It was not made just to make a buck and be fun. The director actually gave a shit and wanted to make it about the character more so than the action, which rarely happens nowadays because they make such huge profits now. They can't take as many risks, which is the one probably biggest downfall of things like the MCU. Like, we're lucky that we're having as many different characters come together in the same style or genre that we're getting, like Shang-Chi or Doctor Strange or Black Panther, all those things. So yeah, I kind of wanted to do this in prep for the new Spider-Man movie coming out next week, which, yes, I already have tickets for. I have to wait a whole day or two to see it. So, hopefully it doesn't get ruined completely by then. It probably will, but I'll love it anyways. I just wanted to talk about the much underappreciated superhero movies that came before the MCU, because that's all people seem to care about nowadays. We weren't lucky enough to get 3 MCU movies a year on top of 2 or 3 DC movies every year. As far as the MCU goes, there's not one MCU movie that I've seen, and honestly at this point the only one I haven't had a chance to see is the Eternals, that I disliked, because none of them are terrible movies. They're all at least pretty well made, or entertaining at least. It might not be exactly what I'm hoping, but you can't go into every movie thinking it's going to be your fantasy script version of that movie. Endgame got pretty damn close. The literal opening and closing scenes of that movie were what I wanted. So when I saw Endgame, I was like, that's it. That's all I needed to see. The other 3 hours in between could have been almost anything, but the opening scene and the end scene were literally the two scenes that I wanted to bookend that film. So no complaints here. So before you enjoy your No Way Home festivities coming soon, pour some out on the curb for the homies of the past, as it were, like Albert Pune for making the Captain America movie, Dolph Lundgren for starring as the Punisher the first time, Bryan Singer, even though he's essentially, I don't know, he's a piece of shit, but he cared enough about the X-Men to want to make an X-Men film, and he did it. So good for him on that. Everything else he does, to hell with him, I guess. But we need to thank him at least for that much. Sam Raimi for loving comic books and Spider-Man and bringing what was probably the first accurate, at least to that point, depiction of a character that's been beloved for decades on the silver screen, and making it the biggest movie ever at the time it was released. A lot of people forget that Spider-Man was the highest opening weekend of all time, and it was the first movie ever to make over $100 million in the first weekend. And, Ang Lee for wanting to make Hulk a serious drama about the characters and not just about the explosions. You got to respect the filmmakers that want to make the superhero movies as opposed to the company that owns the comic books wanting to make movies to make money. So you gotta give love to those people who wanted to make the movies before it was cool, you could say. A lot of younger kids nowadays seem to dismiss or not have any interest in anything that came out before they were born or that isn't still popular, and they just kind of ignore all these movies or don't even know they exist in some cases. So you just need to do something about that and appreciate what we have now by seeing how little we had even 30 years ago for these awesome characters. You're complaining, there's too many superhero movies nowadays, but back in my day, I was lucky to rent a shitty Captain America movie from Mr. Movies that went direct to video when I was 5. This was Derek, the convicted cinephile, rambling for hours about superhero movies. Please follow, like, share, and subscribe. And follow me on Instagram at convicted_cinephile. And yes, I'll be seeing you at Spider-Man No Way Home.